Frank Morrison had been invisible his entire life. For 5 decades, he'd mopped the floors of Riverside Middle School in small-town Nebraska, emptying trash cans and fixing broken desks, while hundreds of students and teachers walked past him like he was part of the wallpaper. They called him Maintenance Frank, when they bothered to call him anything at all. Most of the time, they simply stepped around him and his cleaning cart, without so much as a glance. What nobody knew was that Frank carried the voice of an angel locked inside his chest. Not even his beloved wife Sarah had discovered it until their 25th wedding anniversary, when she caught him singing in her garage late one night, his voice soaring through an old Elvis ballad with such raw power and emotion that she thought someone had turned on the radio. When she realized it was her own husband singing, she stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Frank's musical dreams had died at 17. Back in 1967, he'd been the star of his high school's choir, the boy whose voice could hush an entire auditorium during Christmas concerts. His music teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had practically begged him to audition for music scholarships, convinced that Frank had the talent to sing professionally. But Frank's father, Robert Morrison, was a hard man who believed in hard work and practical choices. When Frank mentioned wanting to study music, his father's response was swift and brutal. "Music don't pay the bills, boy. You'll take that job at the school district and be grateful for steady work." So Frank buried his dreams in a shallow grave and never spoke of them again. He took the maintenance job at Riverside Middle School straight out of high school, married his sweetheart Sarah Jenkins, and settled into a life of quiet routine. Every morning at 6 a.m., he'd unlock the school doors. Every evening at 8 p.m., he'd turn off the lights and lock up. For 50 years, this was his world. The children barely noticed him. To them, he was just the old guy who cleaned up their messes and occasionally helped retrieve balls from the gym rafters. Teachers would nod politely when they passed him in the hallways, but Frank understood his place in their universe. He was background noise, essential but invisible, like the hum of fluorescent lights or the tick of classroom clocks. But here's what made Frank's story extraordinary. He never stopped loving music. Every night after work, he'd sit in his garage with an old radio, singing along to country classics and gospel hymns when he thought nobody could hear. His voice had only grown richer with age, developing a depth and texture that would have made Nashville producers fight over him. But Frank had convinced himself that ship had sailed long ago. Sarah knew, of course. After that night in the garage, she'd tried countless times to encourage him. She'd suggest he join the church choir or maybe just sing at their anniversary party. But Frank would always shake his head and change the subject. The pain of his abandoned dreams ran too deep. It was easier to keep his gift locked away than to risk the heartbreak of hoping again. The years rolled by like seasons. Frank and Sarah never had children, but they found joy in each other's company and in the small rhythms of their quiet life. Sarah worked as a secretary at the same school, where Frank maintained the buildings, and they'd drive home together each evening, content in their shared silence. Sometimes Frank would hum while he worked in their garden, and Sarah would smile to herself, knowing she was hearing something precious that the rest of the world was missing. When Sarah passed away from cancer in 2019, Frank's world collapsed. She'd been his anchor, his reason for getting up each morning, his partner in their gentle life. The grief was so overwhelming that Frank could barely function. He'd show up to work, go through the motions of cleaning and maintaining, then return to a house that felt hollow without Sarah's laughter echoing through the rooms. The school community noticed a change in him. Where once Frank had been quietly cheerful, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand, now he moved through the hallways like a shadow of himself. His shoulders curved inward, his eyes stayed fixed on the floor, and the gentle smile that had been his trademark seemed to have disappeared entirely. It was during this dark period that Frank made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. At 73, after 50 years of service, he decided to retire. He submitted his resignation to Principal Martinez, with a brief note thanking the district for the opportunity to serve. His supervisor, Janitor, tried to talk him out of it, reminding him how much the school relied on him. But Frank's mind was made up. Without Sarah, without a sense of purpose, he felt like he was just marking time until his own end came. His last day at Riverside Middle School was supposed to be unremarkable. Frank had cleaned out his supply closet, turned his keys, and was heading for the parking lot when Principal Martinez's voice crackled over the intercom, asking all students and staff to gather in the gymnasium for a special assembly. Frank's heart sank. He'd hoped to slip away quietly, but it seemed the school had planned some kind of farewell ceremony. Reluctantly, he made his way to the gym, where he found something that took his breath away. The entire school had gathered, all 600 students, every teacher, the office staff, the cafeteria workers, even the bus drivers. They'd made a huge banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. Frank. 50 years of service," and the walls were covered with handmade cards and drawings from students who'd learned to see him as more than just a maintenance man. One by one, people began sharing stories about Frank. How he'd stayed late to help teachers prepare their classrooms. How he'd noticed when young Ashley Rodriguez seemed upset and had quietly sat with her until her mother arrived. How he'd spent his own money to buy art supplies when the school's budget ran short. How he'd never missed a single day of work in 50 years, not even when Sarah was in the hospital during her final weeks. As Frank listened to these stories, something began to stir inside him. He realized that his life hadn't been invisible after all. He'd touched hundreds of lives, maybe thousands, just by showing up and caring. Sarah had always told him that there were many ways to make music in the world, and maybe his had been the quiet symphony of service, the gentle melody of kindness. But then something unexpected happened. 8-year-old Emma Thompson, a third grader with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, raised her hand and asked, "Mr. Frank, would you sing us a song? My mom says you have the most beautiful voice she's ever heard." Frank's face went pale. Emma's mother, Rebecca, was one of the newer teachers, and she'd apparently overheard him humming while he worked late one evening. The gymnasium fell silent. 600 pairs of eyes focused on the old janitor in his worn coveralls. Frank felt his chest tighten with panic. He hadn't sung in front of anyone since high school, hadn't even sung much at all since Sarah's passing. "Oh, I don't think," Frank began, his voice barely a whisper. But then Principal Martinez stepped forward with a knowing smile. "Frank, in 50 years, you've never asked for anything. Not a raise, not recognition, not even a day off. Would you consider this our retirement gift to you? Just one song." Frank looked out at the sea of expectant faces. Children who'd grown up with his quiet presence. Teachers who'd worked beside him for decades. Colleagues who'd shared countless small moments of human connection with him over the years. He thought about Sarah, who'd always believed his gift was meant to be shared. He thought about the boy he'd been at 17, full of dreams and musical passion. And for the first time in 56 years, Frank Morrison made a choice that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the truth of who he was meant to be. He walked slowly to the center of the gymnasium floor. The silence was so complete, you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Frank closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The song he chose was "Amazing Grace," the same hymn he'd sung at Sarah's funeral, the same melody that had sustained him through his darkest hours. But what emerged from Frank's throat wasn't just music. It was pure emotion transformed into sound. His voice, aged like fine wine, filled every corner of that gymnasium with a power and beauty that seemed to bend reality itself. The first note silenced every whisper. By the second verse, teachers were wiping tears from their eyes. By the final chorus, there wasn't a dry eye in the building. Frank's voice soared and dipped, carried pain and hope in equal measure, told the story of a life lived quietly but with profound depth. It was a voice of every dream deferred, every sacrifice made for love, every moment of grace found in the midst of ordinary days. When the last note faded into silence, the gymnasium exploded. 600 people rose to their feet in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Children who had never seen their teachers cry watched grown adults weep openly. Frank stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the response, feeling something he hadn't experienced in decades, the pure joy of sharing his gift with the world. But this was just the beginning of Frank's story, not the end. Emma Thompson's mother had recorded the entire performance on her phone, and by that evening, the video was spreading across social media like wildfire. Retired Janitor's incredible voice stunned school assembly became one of the most watched videos of the year. Record labels started calling. Morning show producers left voicemails. America's Got Talent reached out with an invitation to audition. 3 months later, Frank Morrison found himself standing on the most famous stage in America, wearing the same coveralls he'd worn to work every day for 50 years. The judges, Simon Cowell, Sofia Vergara, Heidi Klum, and Howie Mandel, looked skeptical as this elderly maintenance man approached the microphone. The audience seemed equally uncertain, some even snickering at the sight of this unlikely contestant. "So, Frank," Simon said with his characteristic directness, "what are you going to sing for us today?" Frank's voice was steady as he replied, "I'm going to sing Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers. It was my wife Sarah's favorite song." When the music began and Frank opened his mouth, the transformation was instantaneous. That same supernatural voice that had stunned a middle school gymnasium now commanded the attention of millions of viewers across America. Every note was perfect, every phrase loaded with a lifetime of emotion. By the time he reached the soaring climax of the song, the judges and audience were on their feet, some openly weeping at the raw beauty of his performance. The golden buzzer moment came from Howie Mandel, who later said he'd never heard anything so moving in his life. Frank Morrison, the invisible janitor from Nebraska, became an overnight sensation. His audition video garnered over 50 million views in its first week. Record labels entered a bidding war for his services. He appeared on every major talk show, sang at the Grand Ole Opry, and recorded an album that went platinum within months. But perhaps the most beautiful part of Frank's story wasn't his sudden fame. It was how he chose to use it. He established the Sarah Morrison Foundation, providing music scholarships for underprivileged children whose dreams might otherwise go unrealized. He returned to Riverside Middle School as a volunteer music instructor, teaching kids that it's never too late to chase your dreams and that every person, no matter how invisible they might seem, has something beautiful to offer the world. Frank's story reminds us that talent doesn't have an expiration date, that dreams deferred aren't always dreams denied, and that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come from the most ordinary people. At 74, he proved that it's never too late to step into the spotlight and share the music that's been waiting inside you all along. Today, Frank Morrison is no longer invisible. He's a recording artist, a philanthropist, and an inspiration to millions. But he'll tell you that his greatest accomplishment wasn't winning America's Got Talent or selling albums. It was finally honoring the gift that God gave him and using it to remind the world that every person has value, every life has purpose, and every voice deserves to be heard. So the next time you see someone society has rendered invisible, the janitor, the cashier, the person who keeps your world running while you rush past, remember Frank Morrison. Remember that behind those quiet eyes might be a voice that could change the world, a dream that just needs one moment of courage to take flight, a gift that's been waiting a lifetime to be shared. Because sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen, one moment of courage, and one song to transform not just a life, but the hearts of everyone who hears it.